The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like a shroud, creating an atmosphere of mystery that seemed fitting for what would become one of the most talked-about incidents in recent royal history. Queen Camilla walked through the corridors with purpose, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floors. The weight of the crown, both literal and figurative, had settled upon her shoulders with surprising ease since Charles's passing 6 months earlier. The transition had not been without its challenges. Many within the palace walls still whispered doubts about her legitimacy, her right to wear the crown that had once graced the head of Elizabeth II. These whispers followed her like shadows, even as she performed her duties with grace and determination. Today, however, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made even the most seasoned palace staff exchange worried glances. Sarah Wellington, the Queen's private secretary, hurried to keep pace with Camilla's determined stride. She had worked within these walls for over 2 decades, serving 3 monarchs, and had never seen such resolve in a royal's demeanor. The morning briefing had been routine, ceremonial duties, diplomatic meetings, charity engagements, but something in the Queen's eyes suggested that routine was about to be shattered. The Royal Guard had been a source of particular frustration for Camilla in recent weeks. Unlike the household staff who had gradually warmed to her presence, the guards maintained an icy formality that bordered on disrespect. Their bows were perfunctory, their acknowledgments barely audible, and their eyes often seemed to look through her rather than at her. It was as if they were waiting for someone else, someone they deemed more worthy of their allegiance. Captain James Morrison had been particularly problematic. A veteran of 25 years of royal service, he had served under Elizabeth II with unwavering devotion. His loyalty to the late Queen was legendary, and his adjustment to new leadership had been, to put it mildly, challenging. He commanded respect among his men, and his attitude toward Queen Camilla had set the tone for the entire guard detail. As Camilla approached the state drawing room where the morning guard briefing was taking place, she could hear Morrison's voice through the partially open door. He was discussing security protocols with his subordinates, his tone clipped and professional. But there was something else in his voice, a barely concealed frustration that had been building for months. The Queen paused outside the door, listening to the conversation within. Morrison was addressing a younger guard who had apparently shown too much deference to her during a recent ceremony. "Remember, we serve the crown," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate hallway. "The crown, not necessarily the person wearing it. There's a difference, and it's important that you understand that distinction." The words hit Camilla like a physical blow. The implication was clear. Morrison and his men did not see her as their true sovereign. She was merely someone temporarily occupying a position that rightfully belonged to another. The anger that had been simmering beneath her composed exterior for weeks suddenly blazed into fury. Sarah noticed the change immediately. The Queen's posture straightened, her jaw tightened, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Your Majesty," Sarah whispered urgently, "perhaps we should—" But Camilla was already moving. She pushed open the doors to the drawing room with such force that they struck the walls with a resounding bang. The 5 guards inside snapped to attention, their conversation dying instantly. Morrison turned slowly, his face showing the slightest flicker of surprise, before resuming its usual mask of professional indifference. The room was magnificent, with its soaring ceilings and priceless artwork, but the tension within it was suffocating. Camilla stood in the doorway for a moment, her gaze sweeping across each guard's face before settling on Morrison. The silence stretched on, becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the guards remained at attention, unsure of what was expected of them. "Captain Morrison," Camilla said finally, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even Sarah. I believe we need to have a conversation about respect, duty, and exactly whom you serve in this palace. Morrison's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a barely perceptible straightening that suggested he was preparing for confrontation. "Your Majesty," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "The guard stands ready to serve as we always have." The other guards remained motionless, but their eyes darted between their captain and the Queen. The youngest among them, Guard Thomas Fletcher, looked particularly uncomfortable. He had been the subject of Morrison's earlier criticism, and he could sense that something significant was about to happen. Camilla stepped fully into the room, her presence commanding attention. She had learned much about power and its proper use during her years as Duchess of Cornwall. But this was different. This was about establishing her authority not just as Charles's widow, but as the rightful Queen of England. "For months," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I have watched and waited. I have been patient with the whispered doubts, the sideways glances, and the barely concealed skepticism. I understood that change is difficult, that loyalty to my predecessor runs deep. But what I heard just now goes beyond the bounds of what I will tolerate." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had served in this palace longer than Camilla had been part of the royal family. He had sworn oaths to defend the crown, had stood guard over Elizabeth II through countless ceremonies and state occasions. The idea that this woman, whom many still saw as an outsider, could question his loyalty was almost more than he could bear. The tension in the room was palpable. The other guards remained at attention, but their discomfort was obvious. They had never witnessed such a direct confrontation between a monarch and their captain. The very foundations of palace protocol seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. Sarah Wellington watched from the doorway, her heart racing. She had seen Queen Elizabeth handle difficult situations with grace and subtle authority, but this was something entirely different. This was raw, confrontational, and dangerous. The wrong word, the wrong gesture, could shatter the delicate balance that held the royal household together. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to spotlight the standoff between Queen and guard captain. Both were strong-willed individuals, both convinced of their righteousness, both unwilling to back down. The next few moments would determine not just their relationship, but the very nature of respect and authority within the palace walls. Camilla took another step forward, closing the distance between herself and Morrison. Her eyes never left his face as she prepared to deliver the command that would change everything. The weight of centuries of royal tradition pressed down upon the room, but she was ready to challenge that tradition if necessary. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not a temporary occupant of this throne. I am not a placeholder waiting for someone more suitable to take my place. I am your queen, appointed by God and crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And as your queen, I demand the respect and loyalty that the position deserves." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition that the woman before him was not the uncertain figure he had assumed her to be. The game had changed, and he would have to decide how to respond. The other guards waited, barely breathing, as their captain considered his next words. The future of their service, perhaps their careers, hung in the balance. Queen Camilla stood before them, no longer the hesitant widow seeking acceptance, but a monarch demanding her due. The silence that followed Queen Camilla's declaration was deafening. Captain Morrison stood rigid, his military bearing perfect, but the storm brewing behind his eyes was impossible to miss. For 25 years he had served the crown with unwavering dedication, and never once had he been spoken to in such a manner by anyone, royal or otherwise. The younger guards remained frozen at attention, their eyes fixed straight ahead, but their minds racing. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a direct confrontation between their commanding officer and the sovereign. Such moments were not covered in any training manual, and the implications were staggering. Guard Fletcher felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He remembered Morrison's earlier words about serving the crown rather than the person wearing it, and he wondered if the Queen had overheard. The thought terrified him. His position at the palace was everything to him. It represented not just a career, but a family legacy. His father and grandfather had both served in the Royal Guard, and the shame of dismissal would destroy more than just his future. Sarah Wellington stepped quietly into the room, positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary. She had seen palace crises before, scandals, family disputes, protocol violations, but nothing quite like this. The delicate balance of respect and hierarchy that governed palace life was being tested in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. Queen Camilla's gaze never wavered from Morrison's face. She had learned to read people during her years in the public eye, and she could see the internal struggle playing out behind his carefully controlled expression. He was a man torn between his ingrained sense of duty and his personal reservations about her legitimacy. "Captain," she continued, her voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, "I have been more than patient with the subtle disrespect that has characterized your unit's attitude toward me. The half-hearted bows, the mumbled acknowledgments, the way you and your men look through me as if I were merely occupying space meant for someone else. That ends today." Morrison's hands, clasped behind his back, tightened until his knuckles were white. The Queen's words were accurate, and they stung because they were true. He had been unable to fully accept her authority, seeing her as an interloper in a system that had functioned perfectly well for decades under Elizabeth II. But hearing his actions described so bluntly forced him to confront the reality of his behavior. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, marking time in a room where time seemed to have stopped. The morning sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows across the Persian carpets and highlighting the intricate details of the oil paintings that adorned the walls. These walls had witnessed countless moments of royal history, but few as charged with potential consequence as this one. "Your Majesty," Morrison said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "the Royal Guard has always served with distinction and loyalty. Our dedication to duty is beyond question." It was a diplomatic response, neither accepting nor rejecting the Queen's criticism. But Camilla had not come this far to accept diplomatic evasions. She had spent months watching and learning, understanding the dynamics that governed palace life, and she knew that half measures would be interpreted as weakness. "Dedication to duty requires recognition of authority," she replied sharply. "And recognition of authority requires acknowledgement of who holds it. I am growing tired of having to earn what is rightfully mine by birth and by law." The reference to birth was intentional and pointed. Morrison and many others in the palace hierarchy came from families with long traditions of royal service. They understood bloodlines, heritage, and the weight of tradition. By invoking these concepts, Camilla was reminding them that she was not some commoner who had stumbled into royalty. She was descended from nobility, with her own claim to respect and deference. Guard Fletcher risked a glance toward his captain, wondering how Morrison would respond. The younger man had always admired Morrison's steady leadership and uncompromising standards, but he was beginning to realize that those same qualities might be leading them all toward disaster. The other guards, Williams, Crawford, and Burke, maintained their positions but struggled with the conflicting loyalties the situation presented. They had sworn oaths to serve the crown, but their immediate loyalty was to Morrison, who had trained them, protected them, and earned their respect through years of exemplary leadership. Sarah Wellington checked her watch discreetly. The Queen had other appointments scheduled, but this confrontation clearly took precedence. She made a mental note to reschedule the morning's meetings and began considering how to manage the potential fallout from this encounter. Queen Camilla took another step closer to Morrison, closing the distance between them to mere feet. The move was calculated, designed to emphasize her position and make clear that she would not be intimidated by his military bearing or his years of service. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow made her words more threatening than if she had shouted, "I want you to consider very carefully what happens next. You have served this family with honor, and I respect that service. But respect must flow both ways. I will not be treated as a temporary inconvenience by anyone in this palace, regardless of their length of service or their personal feelings about my right to be here." Morrison's jaw worked silently as he processed her words. The Queen was offering him a way out, an opportunity to step back from the confrontation and reset their relationship. But accepting that offer would require him to acknowledge her authority in a way that went against everything he had been feeling for months. The morning light continued to shift as clouds moved across the sun, creating a constantly changing pattern of illumination in the grand room. The effect was almost theatrical, as if the universe itself was highlighting the drama unfolding between monarch and guard. "Your Majesty," Morrison said slowly, each word carefully chosen, "the royal guard serves the crown with complete loyalty. That has never been in question." Again, the careful language, the diplomatic evasion. But Camilla had run out of patience for such games. She had tried subtlety, had hoped that time and gradual acceptance would solve the problem. But Morrison's earlier comments to his men had made clear that the issue ran deeper than simple adjustment to change. "The crown," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Yes, Captain, you serve the crown, but I am the crown. I wear it, I bear its weight, I carry its responsibilities. When you look at me, you should see not the woman you have personal reservations about, but the embodiment of 1,000 years of British monarchy." The words hit Morrison like physical blows. There was no mistaking their meaning, no way to interpret them diplomatically. The Queen was demanding not just his professional service, but his personal acknowledgement of her legitimacy. The younger guards felt the tension ratcheting higher with each exchange. This was no longer a discussion about protocol or procedure. It was a fundamental challenge to the hierarchy that governed their world. Sarah Wellington moved slightly closer, ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond the point of no return. She had seen royal anger before, but nothing quite like the controlled fury that emanated from Queen Camilla. The moment had come for Morrison to make his choice. He could accept the Queen's authority and submit to her demands, preserving his position but sacrificing his principles, or he could stand firm in his beliefs, knowing that the consequences could end his career and disgrace his family's legacy of service. The clock continued its steady ticking, marking the seconds before Queen Camilla would deliver the command that would shatter decades of established protocol and force Morrison to reveal exactly where his true loyalties lay. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reverberate through the palace for months to come. The tension in the state drawing room had reached a breaking point. Queen Camilla stood facing Captain Morrison, her eyes blazing with royal authority, while the gathered guards maintained their rigid positions, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. The ornate room, with its priceless artwork and centuries of royal history, seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation reached its climax. Sarah Wellington positioned herself near the door, her mind racing through possible damage control scenarios. She had witnessed many palace crises during her 2 decades of service, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The very foundations of royal protocol were about to be tested in ways that could reshape palace dynamics forever. Queen Camilla drew herself to her full height, every inch the sovereign she had become. The weight of the crown might have been absent from her head in this moment, but its authority radiated from her entire being. She had spent months tolerating the subtle disrespect, the questioning glances, and the whispered doubts. No more. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I order you to bow before your queen." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. It was not a request, not a suggestion, but a direct royal command issued in front of witnesses. The implications were staggering. Morrison could comply and acknowledge her authority completely, or he could refuse and face the consequences of open defiance. The younger guards felt their hearts racing. Guard Fletcher's palms were slick with sweat as he realized he was witnessing history being made. This was the moment that would define not just Morrison's career, but the entire relationship between Queen Camilla and the Royal Guard. Morrison stood frozen, his military bearing perfect, but his mind reeling from the directness of the command. In 25 years of service, no monarch had ever demanded such a display from him. Elizabeth II had commanded respect through her mere presence, never needing to explicitly demand acknowledgement of her authority. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady ticking, each second stretching into eternity. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dramatic tableau of monarch and guard captain locked in a battle of wills that would determine the future of their relationship. Sarah Wellington's diplomatic instincts screamed at her to intervene, to find some way to diffuse the situation before irreparable damage was done. But she recognized that this moment belonged to Queen Camilla, that any interference would undermine the very authority the Queen was fighting to establish. "Your Majesty," Morrison said slowly, his voice steady but strained, "I have always bowed to the crown." It was another evasion. Another attempt to avoid the direct confrontation the Queen was demanding. But Camilla was no longer willing to accept such diplomatic language. She had learned too much about power and its proper use to be satisfied with anything less than complete acknowledgement. "That is not what I asked for, Captain," she replied, her voice carrying an edge that made even the seasoned guards uncomfortable. "I did not ask about your past service or your general respect for the crown. I gave you a direct order to bow before your queen, now." The word "now" cracked like a whip, leaving no room for further evasion or delay. Morrison felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. His entire career, his family's legacy of service, his personal pride, everything hung in the balance. The other guards remained at attention, but their loyalty was being tested in ways they had never imagined. They respected Morrison, trusted his leadership, and shared many of his reservations about Queen Camilla. But they also understood the gravity of direct disobedience to a royal command. Guard Fletcher found himself silently praying that Morrison would comply, would swallow his pride and bow to preserve the unity of their unit. The young man had worked too hard to reach his position to see it destroyed by a confrontation that seemed to have no winners. Morrison's hands, clasped behind his back, trembled slightly as he wrestled with his decision. He could see no way to comply without betraying his deeply held beliefs about legitimacy and proper succession. Yet he could see no way to refuse without destroying everything he had worked for throughout his career. The silence stretched on, becoming oppressive. The very air in the room seemed to thicken with tension as everyone waited for Morrison's response. Queen Camilla remained motionless, her gaze never leaving his face, her authority absolute and unwavering. Finally, Morrison's military training took over. He had been conditioned to follow orders, to respect chain of command, to put duty above personal feelings. But when he spoke, his words were not what anyone in the room expected. "No." The single word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. Guard Fletcher felt his knees nearly buckle. Sarah Wellington's face went pale. The other guards maintained their positions but felt their world tilting on its axis. Queen Camilla's expression didn't change. But something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise exactly, but a cold recognition that the moment she had both dreaded and prepared for had finally arrived. Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as he committed fully to his path. "Your Majesty, I have served this crown for 25 years with honor and distinction. I served your predecessor with complete loyalty and respect because she earned it through decades of dedicated service and unwavering commitment to duty. I cannot, in good conscience, offer the same level of deference to someone who has not demonstrated the same qualities." The words hit the room like physical blows. This was not just refusal, it was open rebellion, a direct challenge to royal authority that went far beyond protocol violations. Sarah Wellington stepped forward instinctively, her diplomatic training finally overriding her paralysis. "Captain Morrison," she said urgently, "you need to consider very carefully what you're saying." But Morrison was beyond such considerations. Having committed to his course, he pressed forward with the brutal honesty that had been building inside him for months. "I serve the crown," he continued, his eyes never leaving Queen Camilla's face. "But the crown must be worthy of service. It must embody the values and traditions that make it sacred. I cannot bow to what I do not believe deserves my respect." The room fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the clock sounded like hammer blows. Queen Camilla absorbed Morrison's words without flinching, but the ice in her eyes spoke of consequences that would reshape the palace hierarchy. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost conversational, which made her words more devastating than any shout could have been. "Captain Morrison, you are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. You will surrender your insignia, clear your quarters, and be escorted from the palace within the hour. Your 25 years of service are hereby terminated with dishonor." Morrison's face went white, but he maintained his military bearing even as his world collapsed around him. He had known the risks, had chosen his path deliberately, but hearing the sentence pronounced still struck him like a physical blow. The younger guards felt their foundations crumbling. Fletcher watched his mentor and role model being destroyed before his eyes, understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah Wellington quickly stepped forward, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. "Your Majesty, perhaps—" "There is no perhaps, Sarah," Queen Camilla cut her off. "Captain Morrison has made his position clear. He does not recognize my authority, does not believe I deserve his respect, and refuses to acknowledge me as his queen. There are consequences for such choices." Morrison slowly reached up and removed the insignia from his uniform, the small metal pins that had represented years of dedicated service and personal pride. He placed them carefully on the ornate table beside him, each piece falling with a soft click that seemed to echo through the room. "Your Majesty," he said finally, his voice hoarse but steady, "I hope that history proves me wrong. I hope that you become the queen this country deserves. But I cannot pretend to see something that is not yet there." With those words, he turned and walked toward the door, his military bearing intact even in defeat. The guards parted to let him pass, their faces reflecting their shock and uncertainty about what would come next. Queen Camilla watched him go, her expression unreadable. When the door closed behind Morrison, she turned to face the remaining guards, who stood uncertain and shaken by what they had witnessed. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying new authority born from the confrontation she had just won, "let this be a lesson about respect, loyalty, and the consequences of choosing wrong. I am your queen, not by your permission, but by divine right and constitutional law." Those who cannot accept this reality are free to follow Captain Morrison's example. Guard Fletcher felt his heart pounding as the Queen's gaze swept over them. When she looked directly at him, he made his choice instantly, dropping to one knee in a bow so deep it bordered on genuflection. "Your Majesty," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. One by one, the other guards followed suit, understanding that the old order had passed and a new one had been established through the simple act of one man's refusal and the Queen's unflinching response. Queen Camilla stood among the kneeling guards, finally receiving the acknowledgment she had demanded. But as she looked down at these men whose respect had been won through confrontation rather than earned through time, she wondered if the victory felt as hollow to them as it did to her. The morning sun had climbed higher, flooding the room with bright light that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past. Outside, the palace continued its daily routine, unaware that within its walls, the very nature of royal authority had been tested, challenged, and ultimately reaffirmed through the devastating simplicity of one word: no.